Hello everyone, and welcome to Charlotte Dixon, the place where the most chilling, mysterious, and haunting stories from around the world are brought to life in vivid detail. If you love ghostly tales, dark folklore, and the sinister secrets hiding behind villages, festivals, and seemingly innocent gatherings, then you've come to the right place. Today, Charlotte Dixon takes you deep into the feast at the end of the road, a long-form Filipino horror story about eerie rural festivals where friendly invitations lead to a table no one should sit at. From a river journey into an isolated village with meat but no sign of slaughter, to processions of the headless and unspeakable feasts, every moment reveals a deadly cycle of possession, abduction, and ritual. This is a road that never truly ends, and a feast that will always be waiting for you. The day we went to Pampang began like 100 other river days, with the sunlight pressing against the water in glittering shards and the low hum of boat engines somewhere upriver. But there was something in the air, not in the wind, which was still, but in the way people spoke, short and clipped, as if words themselves weighed too much to carry. We had been debating whether or not to go down to the place they called 15 that afternoon. It wasn't an official name, just something everyone in the area seemed to understand without explanation. Some of the others had already gone, traveling in pairs with siblings or close friends, but in the end, we stayed behind. I told myself it was because we weren't in a hurry, but in truth, there was a quiet pull toward something else, something I didn't yet understand. When we finally decided to head out, the river was still a dull mirror, reflecting the pale sky without a ripple. The boat we took was an old wooden thing, the paint stripped away by years of sun and water, the smell of damp wood and oil clinging to its hull. I sat toward the middle, my knees pressed against the worn edge, watching the current slip by. Maddle sat near the boatman at the front. She leaned close to him, speaking in a dialect I didn't know. Her voice was low, the kind of low meant to keep words from drifting back to the passengers. The boatman's eyes flicked toward us every so often, sharp and assessing, before returning to the water. I didn't want to be obvious, but I tried to listen anyway. The words blurred together, unfamiliar, too quick for me to catch. That was when Chris, who was standing closer to them, glanced back at me. His expression was unreadable, but he leaned toward me just enough to whisper. It's like he told her not to make us go too far. The phrase lodged itself in my head like a splinter. Too far from what? Too far from the shore? From the main river? From safety? I wanted to ask, but Maddle was already looking at us with a practiced smile. He'll just tell us when we're there, she said lightly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I forced a nod, but unease had already curled itself around my thoughts. The air was warm, but I felt the kind of cold you can't shake with a jacket. We drifted for what felt longer than it should have taken. No one spoke much. The only sounds were the occasional groan of the boat's frame and the quiet slap of water against wood. I stared at the banks sliding past us, watching how the trees seemed to bend inwards, their branches leaning toward the water like they were trying to listen. When the boat finally nudged against the shore, the world seemed to narrow. The riverbank here was lower, muddier, and the houses were closer together, as if huddled against something unseen. That was when the children came running. They emerged from between the houses near Pampang, their bare feet slapping against the packed dirt. At first, I thought they were playing the kind of reckless sprint kids do when chasing each other. But there was no laughter, no shouting. Their movements were urgent, almost frantic, like people rushing for relief goods when a truck arrives. I had seen that same speed, that same single-minded focus in Lanta after storms, when everyone tries to get in line before supplies run out. But these children weren't running toward supplies. They were running toward us. Before they could reach us, Maddle stepped forward. Her voice cut through the air, sharper than I'd ever heard it. This is ours, she said, and then again, more firmly. This is ours. The children slowed, confusion flickering across their faces. A few turned back reluctantly, but some just stood there, watching us. They didn't look angry. They didn't even look curious. They looked still. Too still for children. Something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about visitors or food or territory. This was about us. About me, Chris, and whoever else Maddle had brought. And whatever it was, we were already part of it. I didn't speak. I just followed as Maddle led us deeper into the village. The air grew heavier with every step. The smell reached us first, smoke, fat, and the metallic tang of meat cooking over open flames. There were large blackened pans set on stones, flames licking at their edges. The people worked methodically, turning skewers, stirring pots. But something was off. I scanned the area for livestock. Pigs, cows, goats, but there were none. No pens, no rope ties, no animals waiting to be slaughtered. Just the meat, already cut, already cooking. We passed by groups of people who looked up at us as we walked. Some smiled, but the smiles were thin, quick, as if they were painted on for our benefit. One man, stirring a pot, muttered to someone beside him, "That's a lot," his eyes flicking toward us. Maddle didn't react. She led us straight to a group in the center, where chicken and fish were being grilled. I recognized the smell instantly, and for a brief moment, my chest loosened. This, at least, was familiar. A man was crouched at the side, cleaning more chicken and fish with quick, precise movements. Beside him, an older man, his father maybe, spoke without looking at us. "When someone visits us," he said, "we only need to know their last name." He glanced up at Maddle. "Marquez," she answered. "Marquez, please visit us," the old man repeated. "We won't bother you anymore. We won't accept anything from anyone. If we want to eat, we cook ourselves, and we'll just eat from there. As long as our neighbors say anything to you, just answer, 'Marquez, please visit us.'" The way he said it made my skin prickle. It sounded less like a welcome and more like a password. I caught Chris's eye, but he looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the food. We sat down and ate. The chicken was dry but clean tasting, the fish soft and smoky. No one laughed. No music played. The only sounds were the clink of utensils and the occasional crackle of the fire. This wasn't like any gathering I'd ever been to. There was no joy here, only a strange, quiet watchfulness. By late afternoon, the light had shifted to that deep gold that bleeds into red. The boatman reappeared, standing just far enough away that we'd have to notice him without him calling out. It was time to leave. Maddle's mother pressed food into our hands even when we refused. "For you," she said, her eyes fixed on mine. "Thank you for visiting." Her grip lingered too long, and for a moment, I felt something like a shiver pass through me. On the way back, some of the neighbors moved in a way that made me think they might block us. But Maddle walked ahead, her posture rigid, her eyes forward. They stepped aside as we passed, but their eyes stayed on us until we reached the boat. It was still light when we reached the other shore. That was when Maddle's facade cracked. Her shoulders sagged, and tears welled up in her eyes. She turned to us and whispered, "I'm sorry if you were scared." Then she told us what she hadn't before. Her neighbors were possessed. Not in the way preachers describe, not the writhing, screaming kind of possession, but something older, heavier. "A strong kind of possession," she said. "One that the owners of the bodies can't remove. They don't eat humans," she added quickly. "They gave you chicken. That's enough. Don't look at them differently." I nodded, but my unease didn't lift. When I got home, I hesitated to touch the food her mother had given me. Finally, I opened the plastic. Inside, along with the chicken, was a small pinch of salt. Later, I asked a neighbor about it. They told me the salt was a sign, an assurance that the meat wasn't human. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I thought the food was dangerous, but because I couldn't stop wondering
I didn't trust
why they needed
the
to
moment he
assure us
opened
in
his
the
mouth.
first place. Not because of what he said, but because of the way he said it, round vowels, the drawn-out endings, the faint vocal fry that felt practiced, as if he'd borrowed it from someone he admired in Makati and wore it like an expensive watch. When he asked, "Bro, where in Manila are you from?" I was so busy wondering how he knew we were from Manila that I forgot to ask the obvious question. How did he find me in the first place? I told him our area anyway, and he nodded like he'd been there himself, like he knew every alley and bakery and jeepney stop. He introduced his companions, names that sounded like doorways to places I'd never been. Ezekiel, Raphael, Tomas, and the way he did it drew my friends in despite themselves. We learned they were from Makati with a friend from Samar in tow, there for reasons as hazy as the light around us. Our friend Ezekiel is hosting a little town fiesta, Ignacio said finally, softening his tone, and he smiled as if the invitation were a test we were supposed to pass. We agreed without meaning to a chorus of yeah. Sure, why not, the lazy surrender of people who believe nothing truly strange happens in broad daylight. Later, we exchanged glances, the quick conspiratorial kind that say, he's arrogant, right? It wasn't just the accent. It was the weight of attention on me, like I'd been picked out of a crowd by someone who already knew my name. The next day, I stepped out to the sari-sari to buy a bottle of Yossi and clear my head. Ignacio appeared the way bad weather does. One moment the sky is fine, the next it's about to crack open. Bro, he said, too close, too calm. It's the fiesta. I remember the gap in the world that followed. The road blurring, the sun smearing into pale white, the sound of a tricycle bending into a high, thin whine. Then I was inside a big house that smelled like citrus and old wood, every surface polished until it held my face in miniature. The place had the hush of money, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. The furniture looked dipped in gold, maybe not real, but close enough that the idea clung to it. People moved about in shorts and sundresses and airy polos, casual where that made their faces look more formal. It felt like a family gathering for a dynasty pretending to be ordinary. Ignacio told stories that didn't stick. They slid over me like oil. Half histories of a town I didn't know. References to names like they were landmarks. De La Pena, Osorio, Quaranti. Skip stones meant to impress me with their distance. Ezekiel arrived later, smiling with his eyes and not his mouth. We have food, he said. Everything you could want. Silver clinked, chairs scuffed, and plates began materializing in front of me at a fine dining pace. Domes lifted with a flourish, steam sighing up into the chandelier. The food looked beautiful and smelled wrong. Not rotten, not spoiled, just wrong. Like perfume on fruit. There were sauces the color of old wounds, meats with a sheen that caught the light like a cut. Some dishes tasted like they belonged to no language I knew. Bitter that became sweet and bitter again. Sour that felt like a hand pushing down on my tongue. I couldn't identify a single thing I swallowed. I told myself it was foreign cuisine, an unfamiliar regional thing, a palate I hadn't learned yet. The lie held until the woman arrived. She had that look some people carry when they know you've already failed their test. Eyebrows a fraction too high, mouth tilted into a private joke. She sat across from me without asking and said something I couldn't understand, like words spoken through a wall or underwater. Ignacio's face closed the way a door does when the party's full. He frowned, then frowned deeper. The others around us froze in that way people do when trouble walks in, every muscle ready for a shape to break. The woman kept speaking, soft and patient, and the more she talked, the more Ignacio looked like someone counting backward through a memory he didn't want to reach. When she finished, she turned to me and smiled, a small, immaculate crescent, and rose without a sound. Ignacio leaned in, voice suddenly too gentle. Bro, sorry, I'll take you now. I didn't answer, couldn't. My throat felt sealed with ash. I stood and followed him, buoyed by the odd certainty that if I spoke, my voice would not belong to me. We passed through a corridor where portraits stared without eyes. We crossed a foyer where a clock ticked wrong. Too slow, then too fast, then right as if trying on tempos. We stepped through the gates and the world flickered like a dying light bulb. And then I was standing outside our inn as if I'd walked there on my own 2 feet, as if I'd never left. My friends screamed when I opened the door. 13 hours, one of them said, shoving a phone into my hands. Where the hell were you? Missed calls stacked like a funeral hymn. Their fear beat against me harder than the afternoon heat. I was at a house, I said, and the words felt pale and useless. With Ignacio, with Ezekiel. But when I tried to explain where that house stood, my mind slid off its edges. I could summon its staircase, the chandelier, the taste that didn't belong to any country. I could recall the way the woman's smile felt like a staged apology. But streets and turns and landmarks were gone. replaced by a white seam in my memory that wouldn't stitch. Later, I'd hear stories that made the same shape as my absence. Rich families that didn't live where their houses stood. Rooms that appeared only during feast days. Invitations given to one person from a group because that person's name had been whispered by someone at the river. I never found Ignacio again. Ezekiel either. When I walked the town after, nothing bent toward their names. At night, the chandelier in my mind kept shaking, even when the rest of the house in that memory stood perfectly still. I wish that was the end, that I could mark those 13 hours with a black pin and call it the last time the line in my life broke. But the town was coming into feast. Another, and then another, because here saints don't pass like days on a calendar. They overlap, their nights spilling into each other until the road itself feels like a procession that can't end. "Call me Kara," the girl said the next afternoon when we shared a plastic bench outside a Halo stall. She had the kind of tired eyes that come from being happy in the wrong place. "I'm from Valenzuela. I came home for St. Ildefonso because my aunt asked." She said aunt the way some people say sentence. She'd met Daong online through her cousin Loda, adopted sister, long story, and the three of them had spent the day devouring the feast. Rice cakes, skewers, jellies and cups whose colors didn't exist in nature. When night came and the saint's shadow fell long over the road, the beauties in their gowns and the escorts in their barongs began to gather where the light pooled. "We were waiting for the parade," Kara said. And then Daong disappeared. The timing was bad. Across the square, a man shouted that there were a swang in the woods. People ran. It was that same relief goods run I'd seen in Pampang. Focus narrowed to a single point where fear and desire were the same thing. Kara and Loda didn't follow. They went looking for Daong instead, and they found her behind an old heart-shaped fountain with broken tiles, washing her hands like a surgeon caught between operations. "I thought she was one of them," Kara said. "She looked like she'd crawled out of a story to punish us for telling it wrong." But Daong shook her head, fast and furious. "The truth," she said, "was uglier. My clan is full of a swang," she told them evenly, like a tired cashier reciting a price. She'd gone to a neighbor named Chihinko and smelled death on the air. Fresh, like it still remembered the throat it came from. She followed the scent to the woods, lost it, found it again, then found a woman on the ground, the ruin of the body already beginning to quiet. Daong pulled a dagger and came down hard. The thing escaped, but not clean. "I hit its back," she said. "And I hit it deep." Kara didn't believe her. Not really. Belief is a room with a lock, and some of us don't own the key. But when she and Loda got home later, they found Tito Henair, Kara's uncle's second husband, face down on a woven mat, biting a belt while Loda dabbed at the deep slash down his shoulder blade. He said he ran into the aswang after it fed. Kara told me. He said he fought it off, but he didn't say how. Loda didn't look surprised. That scared me more than the cut. Kara wanted to accuse him, to tear the mask off the night and say, "I know what you are." But Henair slipped out the door into the darkness of the next street, where every figure is a cousin until it isn't. But I went back to Valenzuela thinking maybe stories are just TV. We might have let that hang forever if the procession hadn't reared up then. A glittering snake of light and sound and devotion, pulling our attention toward the church like a tide. The square filled with gowns and barongs, sequins and rosaries. Rammel, one of the waiters for the feast, wove between tables with perfect grace, the learned dance of someone who knows to keep his head low when faith has too many faces. He told me about Vivian and Loro while refilling our water, how they'd been together 5 years and looked like a photograph someone had taken to last. "But tonight," Rammel said, "they looked sad." He said it quietly, like naming it might trigger something. He asked his brother Rhoda about it, just a casual nudge between courses, when the ground fell out from under the conversation. "Who are you talking about?" Rhoda said blankly. "Vivian has no escort. Loro died last week. Car accident." Rammel turned then, because of course he did, because the body obeys the story it's already in. He looked, and he swore he saw Loro beside Vivian, wearing the same immaculate barong he'd worn last year, hand just close enough to touch without blessing. "I followed them," Rammel said. "I had to." The procession folded him in, the way a wave folds a swimmer until the sea gets to decide who is drowning. He saw Laura walking with the escorts, smiling a little too steadily, head not quite turning like it should, the jaw working as if remembering how to make a face. Vivian looked sad, he repeated. Someone told me at the hospital he promised to keep the promise even if he was gone. The promise of lovers is a loop. I will be with you. Even when I cannot be with you, I will be with you. Sometimes the world listens. Sometimes the wrong thing keeps its word. I want to tell you none of these threads belong together. Ignacio's house that sits where maps cannot. Dayang's dagger finding a spine it wasn't meant to find. A dead boy walking beside a girl who hasn't cried enough. And the pinch of salt hidden in a plastic bag of chicken to certify it didn't come from the wrong body. But when I lay them end to end, when I pull gently so they overlap, they make one road. It begins at the river in Pampang where children run for visitors like their rations. And it crosses the red evening where Madeline cries because she brought us home alive from neighbors who eat only what they cook. It passes through a gate where portraits watch without eyes and taste sits on the tongue like a rumor. It winds into woods where some families are built like a cabinet with secret compartments. And into squares where saints ride higher than the dead who walk upright only because love taught them not to fall. If there's a map, it's made of feast days and invitations. If there's a rule, it is this: the thing that wants you will learn your name before you say it. The night after I heard Ramel's story, I dreamed the house again. Ignacio at one end of a long table, Ezekiel at the other, and between them a woman who smiled without teeth. Plates arrived and arrived. An endless parade of meals with beautiful names and wrong hearts. I lifted a dome and found the river from Pampang, cooked down to a thick glaze that smelled like a song I knew but couldn't place. I lifted another and found Dayang's dagger, hilt warm, blade wet, laid on greens with a lemon slice that wept clear tears. A third dome covered a barong folded like an apology. When I looked up, Ignacio said softly, "Bro, this is the course where you remember." I woke with the taste of iron. In the hallway outside our room, someone walked past with a limp, the sound of a heel not touching the ground. The inn door at the end of the corridor clicked open and closed without footsteps fading. I counted to 13 because the number had to be good for something. At breakfast, Kara told me she dreamed of washing her hands at the fountain, while a voice behind her counted down from a number she didn't recognize. Ramel said he'd seen Vivian sitting alone in the church, a space beside her kept warm by nothing. And me, I went to the river alone and watched the water decide whether to remember its shape. On the way back, a boy approached and said a single rehearsed line, "Marquez, please visit us." His accent wasn't his. His smile belonged to the woman in the house and to the neighbors in Pampang and to something I hadn't met yet but knew I would. I said I couldn't. He nodded like he'd expected that answer and handed me a small twist of paper. Inside was a pinch of salt. "For later," he said, "in case you forget what the food is." That night the feast grew louder, the saints taller, the music brighter, and in the woods something with a wound on its back learned to move without pain. In the square, Vivian walked with her hands folded and her eyes on a distance that was not the church. Ramel served water to a table where no one drank. Kara called Valenzuela and let it ring once, twice, 13 times. And I waited for Ignacio to step out of whatever wall he used for a door and say, "Bro, sorry, I'll take you now." Because there are houses you can only leave when someone decides you may, and processions you can only join if your name fits the mouth of the saint who needs you. I slept with the salt under my tongue, a small hard truth that kept the wrong taste away. Somewhere, a clock in a room that didn't exist learned how to keep time again, but not for me. Not yet. The next morning a message slid under our door. A single sentence in a careful hand, "We are going down to 15 today. Come if you want to see where the road ends." I thought of the children running, the way Madeline had stood between us and them, the way she cried when the shore took us back. I thought of 13 hours that folded themselves into a single breath and held me under. I thought of a promise spoken by the wrong mouth in a procession that passed for love. I put the paper in my pocket and felt the words heat against my thigh like a fever. The river would be smooth again. The boat would shudder at the same places. The house would smell like citrus if it wanted to. Dayang's blade would find or miss its mark according to a rule no one had written down. Somewhere ahead, something that had learned my name was setting a table. "Don't look at them differently," Maddle had said. I didn't know who she meant anymore. Maybe everyone. Loro should not have been able to look at me. I took another pinch of salt. He was a story already. Into the day that was already waiting kept too long. A name that had learned to float after its body sank. And yet, when the procession slowed at the bend before the church, his face turned. The motion was careful, like a hinge that hadn't been oiled in years, and his eyes found mine as if I were the thing that didn't belong. That was when I knew the whole scene was tilted, that grief had built a stage and invited the wrong actors. Tears ran from his eyes and did not stop. They streamed, pooled in the corners, slid down his cheeks, and then the tears themselves began to thin into air, each drop vanishing before it could fall. For a few seconds he faded in front of me. Outline first, then the texture of his skin, then the dark bead of his pupils, until Vivian was the only figure left standing in the carriage, a bride without a groom in a parade that pretended everything was old and orderly. The drumline struck once, twice, and the gap where he had stood stitched itself with sound. I wanted to believe in tricks of light the way people want to believe the water is shallow because the bottom looks close. But all night the world brought me other mouths to feed the same fear. In 2015, long before I learned how to speak to the river without repeating myself, I said yes to a party in a town I won't name. 2 occasions, they said, a child's birthday and a cousin's homecoming, the kind of double joy that makes people set 3 tables when one would do. The house itself smiled with copper pots and clean windows. The yard laughed with plastic chairs that had seen 30 summers and would see 30 more. We were welcomed as if our names carried luck. While we ate, his wife hovered with the insistence of a good host who has paid the price of the food herself. "Is it delicious?" she asked, eyes bright. We nodded because it was simpler to nod, and the plates truly were a study in tenderness. The meat was soft and clean, the gravy thin but deep, the fat melting like a memory you don't want to keep. Then she said, "Same tone, same brightness. It is, right? Because it's made from human organs." Conversation collapsed. Our forks hung in the air, little metal bridges going nowhere. She laughed, quick and sharp, and waved it away. "I'm joking." Her husband laughed too. Everyone followed, except the part of me that had been taught to listen for the sentence hidden behind the sentence. After that, I couldn't eat the meat, not because I was sure, but because my mouth had learned a new shape for doubt. I switched to soup. It was good. A clean broth with the honest sweetness that comes from bones and time. I tipped the bowl toward my lips and felt relief boiling up into forgiveness. People joke badly, that's all. They see your city clothes and think they should test you. And then something hard clinked against the porcelain. Finger. Small, pale, unarguable. It brushed my upper lip with the rubbery insistence of a thing that wants to be named. I pressed my hands into the table to keep them from shaking and tilted the bowl again to be sure, hoping for a chicken foot with a strange cut, a root, a carved piece of cartilage. I met the dull nail, the knuckle, the blind insistence of a human shape. The wife was looking at me the way a fisherman watches a float for that first, telling tug. I excused myself with the politest lie I have ever made and left the table without touching another spoon. Left the yard without touching another hand. Left the street without touching the ground if my legs could manage it. We fell out of contact after, and that should have been mercy. But some jokes cannot be unfelt. They live under your tongue and salt everything you swallow. When you begin to notice the seam in the world, more threads come loose and loop around your wrists. Avi told me about the Kazalang Bayan where he married his wife in the mayor's office. For couples at once. Everyone wearing happiness like you wear a barong you can't afford to stain. Midway through the vows, the door opened with authority. The kind of confident entrance a late guest makes. Only no one stepped through. The mayor closed it himself. A small, embarrassed smile that smoothed the wrinkle of the moment. That was when Avi felt the sprint of his heart, that feral animal inside the ribs announcing a storm. He turned, and there they were. 2 people in wedding attire, hand in hand, looking at the mayor the way lost travelers look at a station clock. Their heads were wrong, dented and slick with fresh blood, their arms ribboned with scratches, but the eyes held an expectation so ordinary it almost canceled the horror. Avi touched his wife's elbow and asked her to look. When she turned, she saw only the gilded certificates on the wall. The ceremony finished, and the room cheered, and every time Avi tried to face forward, he found he could not. Behind him, the couple stood, patient as etiquette, the repeated vision of a truth no one else had a duty to carry. He watched them walk straight through the closed door, like water through a screen. Outside, a crowd had gathered. 2 men approached the mayor, breathless. A couple, dead on arrival, hit by a truck on the road to the municipality. She's still in her gown, he's still in his suit, their parents carrying the rings. Avi said nothing. Later, when he dreamed, he woke to the feeling of rice hitting his hair, phantom blessings thrown by hands that could no longer lift. Not every feast takes place at a table. Sometimes you eat with your eyes and your fear. Lorenzo's story tasted like both. A friend brought him out to a distant relative's house in Quezon, the kind of invite you accept because declining would require explaining a boundary you can't quite defend. The table groaned with meat, rich stews, roasted slabs, skewers that bled clean juice when you bit them. The tenderness was unnatural. The bones split too easily. The satisfaction spread through the body like a slow drug. Everyone insisted they eat more, because sometimes love is measured by how much you can be made to take. Full to illness, Lorenzo excused himself to find the bathroom. Around back, the house had another face. Jars lined against the wall like mute witnesses, hair clogging the drain, a pile of hands and feet that no one had thought to bury yet. Dried blood traced the story across concrete in a script even children could read. He looked through the kitchen window and saw the board hung from a hook, the pale circle of a head turning gently with the draft. A figure slid into the frame and scored the skin like a fishmonger marking price by weight. Lorenzo fled. At the gate, the hosts pressed a plastic bag heavy with meat into his hands. For the road, and he ran without taking it. He has not told his friend. There are truths that can be spoken only at the cost of all your future meals. Iza was 10 in May of 2008 when the band came to their town. The kind of small wonder that lifts everyone out of their doors and onto the front steps. She chased the drums, the twirlers with their spinning batons, and found instead another parade that no one else seemed to see. Musicians with no heads, uniforms soaked in dark patches that caught the sun and refused to glitter, hands gripping instruments as if the bodies remembered their jobs even after losing their faces. A few carried lamps that threw weak light on the road ahead, as if the day were not enough. She followed until the sound of the normal band overtook the not band, until the drums of the living erased the shape of the dead. She has spent every festival since moving toward and away from noise at the same time. Put these 4 things beside Laura's steady tears and Vivian's lonely carriage, and the outline sharpens. A feast that asks you to confirm what you are eating. A wedding that finishes the ceremony for those who cannot arrive. A table that measures tenderness by how much of your memory it can grind. A procession that teaches a child that music is a mouth you can play even when your head is gone. And always, somewhere nearby, a polite invitation with your name already correct on the envelope. Do not look at them differently, Maddle had said, as if kindness could insulate against hunger. I tried. I truly did. But the town had begun to speak to me in one voice across different throats. On one street, a boy pressed salt into my palm. On another, a bride watched a door for a groom who would not open it. Down by the river, a boatman kept his eyes on the bend as if beyond it the water were someone's mouth. I kept walking, because that is what you do when a map begins to write itself under your feet. The night after Iza told me about the headless marchers, the square filled with the ache of practice. The same saints, the same songs, the same circles of old women already crying at the real ones, with banners snapping in the wind, a tray of glasses, with the sharp cheer of drums and the smiles of girls tossing candy into the crowd. But this was not that. This was a line of bodies moving as if a single will pulled them forward, a will that didn't care about the living or the dead. It began with the women. From a distance, they might have been mistaken for majorettes, their arms swinging in time, shoulders square, heads tilted in concentration. But as they came closer, the shapes in their hands came into focus. Not sticks, not batons, ropes, and at the end of each rope, something that made my stomach go cold. A head, human, severed clean at the neck, hair matted with fresh blood. They swung them in slow, deliberate circles, not fast enough to be a weapon, not slow enough to be ceremonial, just steady, as if the act of swinging kept something else from happening, like a charm you couldn't stop or the thing you were holding might wake up and speak. Behind them came the men, bare-chested, each carrying a bone so large it had to have come from something that no longer walked this earth. They raised the bones high and brought them down on drums made from stretched hide, the sound low and thick, like the heartbeat of a creature far underground. The ground seemed to hum with each strike. Last in the line were 3 men with tarnished trumpets. The instruments caught no light. Their surfaces were dull, like metal that had been buried too long. The sound they made was worse than any scream, thin and reedy, as though they were forcing air through a throat that had forgotten how to sing. The air was thick with the smell of iron. My vision tunneled. The women passed within arm's reach, the ropes still turning, and I saw the heads more clearly. Eyes clouded white, mouths half open as if they had been stopped mid-word. Then I saw the drummers. Their necks were fountains, blood spilling fresh as though the cut had been made only moments ago. The color was so bright it seemed to burn my vision. Something in me broke. The line between them and me collapsed. In a blink, I was not standing there watching. I was lying among them, looking up at the sky from a headless body. I could feel the weight of absence where my face should have been. And then there was nothing. When I woke, I was staring at the cracked ceiling of our home. My mother sat beside me, her hand pressed to my forehead. Her face was tight, her lips pale. "They found you on the roadside," she said softly. "Your hair, all gone. You weren't breathing right." She didn't say I had been unconscious for hours, but her eyes told me. I stayed in bed for 3 days before she agreed to let me be taken to the hospital. The neighbors said the same thing. I had been ridden by evil elements. Possession, not the violent kind, but the deep kind, when something steps inside you and tests how your body fits. That should have been the end. But San Juan Cerneb's feast was not finished with me. In our town, the pista is not just an excuse to eat and drink. It is a kind of contract. Every guest knows they will be drenched. It's tradition. It's fun. And in 2005, when I was still a boy with too much energy and too little sense, I decided to improve on that tradition. My bowl of water would not be plain. It would be salt water. I had heard the old talk. Salt burns what is not human. It drives away what hides in beauty. I wanted to see for myself. I stood at the gate, bowl in hand, watching the road. Laughter echoed from the other side of the street where children were ambushing their cousins. Women shrieking in mock anger when soaked. Then I saw her, a woman walking toward me, her pace unhurried, her smile faint but there. She was beautiful in the way people in the city talk about film stars. Skin smooth, hair glossy, eyes that seemed to look past you and right at you at the same time. I didn't think twice. I tipped the bowl. The salt water cascaded over her head, soaking her hair, running down her cheeks. The scream that followed was not human. It rose in pitch until it scraped the inside of my ears. She crumpled to the ground, clutching her face. At first I thought she had been blinded, and I stepped forward, intending to help. But as I drew close, the beauty began to melt. Her skin bubbled and peeled away in wet ribbons, revealing the darkened, sagging flesh beneath. Wrinkles crawled across her cheeks and forehead faster than I could follow. Her eyes swelled grotesquely, pushing against the lids. Then she moved. One moment she was on her knees, the next she was lunging at me, her hand like a claw on my arm. She pulled me close, her breath thick and foul, and I saw the teeth. Too many, too sharp, before she lowered her mouth toward my neck. Shouts broke the spell. Someone ran in from down the road and grabbed her, dragging her back. She fought like an animal, biting at the man's sandal until the strap tore. Then she turned and ran, vanishing into the side streets. At the hospital, the doctors were baffled by the marks on my arm. They looked human, but deeper, more ragged. The police tried to find her, but the neighbors said she had left for her province. The last anyone saw of her. She was covered in wrinkles from head to toe, her skin hanging loose as if whatever had kept her beautiful was gone. I never touched salt water again at the pista. If I had learned my lesson, I might have avoided what came next. But the story I'm about to tell isn't mine. It belongs to my Uncle Bayani. And it taught me that danger in these towns doesn't just come in processions. It lives in the houses too. He was young then, in that cocky stage of life when men think they can talk their way out of anything. His friends Tony and Ferdy invited him to a party in a village none of them had been to before. Tony was the one most eager. Ferdy had a cousin there, supposedly beautiful, and Tony wanted to see her for himself. The three of them squeezed into a tricycle, the wind carrying their laughter. But the driver wasn't laughing with them. He kept glancing at them in the mirror, his expression unreadable. Finally, as they passed the last stretch of rice fields, he spoke. "Don't stay too late in that village," he said. "And when they offer you something to drink, make sure it's sweet sago. If they offer alcohol, refuse it." Tony chuckled. "Why? Gonna get us drunk and rob us?" The driver didn't smile. "No, you drink their way, and you won't leave the same." Bayani leaned forward. "What's their way?" The driver's eyes stayed on the road. "It's not about what's in the drink. It's about who's offering it. In that village, when they drink with you, they're deciding if you're theirs." No one spoke for a moment. Then Tony tried to lighten the mood. "And if they are chasing someone? Don't help," the driver said immediately. "They're not chasing to punish. They're chasing to catch what they need." "What do they need?" Ferdy asked. The driver finally glanced back, just long enough for Bayani to see the seriousness in his eyes. "Meat," he said, and then he laughed, but the sound was wrong. Too thin, like it had been added after the fact. The rest of the ride was quiet. The fields gave way to clustered houses, the kind that seemed to lean in toward the road, as if they didn't like the open sky. Lanterns glowed on porches, but their light felt more like warning than welcome. Bayani would later say that if they had turned back then, the whole night would have ended differently. But they did. Uncle Bayani they got out of the tricycle that the strangest thing about that night wasn't what they had been waiting for them. It was how normal everything looked when they first arrived. After the tricycle driver's warnings, they'd been ready for something out of an old movie. The moment outsiders arrive, the villagers stop talking. Every eye turns to follow them. A silence so heavy it presses on your back. But as they stepped off at the dusty corner that marked the edge of the barangay, nothing like that happened. Children kept playing in the street. Old men kept slapping cards onto a wobbly table, the smell of cheap gin thick around them. Women bent over washtubs, gossiping while their hands worked. A couple of teenagers in mismatched basketball jerseys dribbled a ball between houses. If anyone noticed the three strangers, they didn't show it. They were barely 10 minutes in when a group of young locals, maybe in their 20s, came up smiling and introduced themselves. They talked easily, joking about the festival, the weather, the heat. One said they'd been chatting with Tony online before, and now it was great to meet his Manila friends in person. It felt almost too easy when the group invited them over for lunch. The house was large by provincial standards, 2 stories, with a wide veranda and a yard shaded by tall fruit trees. The air inside smelled warm and savory. In the center of the main room, a long wooden table groaned under the weight of the spread. Bowls of stew rich with dark sauce, platters of fried meat, skewers glistening with oil, soups sending up fragrant steam. They ate until their bellies were heavy. Uncle said the meat was tender, almost too tender, the flavor deep but strangely clean, leaving no grease on the tongue. Then Tony excused himself to fetch his car from the other side of the village where he'd parked. He was gone for less than 2 minutes. When he came back, his face was pale, his jaw tight. "We need to leave," he said quietly. "What? Why?" Ferdy asked. Tony hesitated, then leaned in, his voice lower. "I saw a trash can down the side path, full of chicken feathers." "That's it." Uncle frowned. Tony shook his head. "Not just feathers, fingers." At first they thought he was joking, but his eyes didn't blink, so they followed him. The trash can stood in the corner where 2 narrow alleys met, a sagging mesh net thrown over the top. From a distance, it looked like ordinary waste from slaughter day, white and brown feathers, scraps of skin, bits of fat. But as they got closer, the other shapes emerged. Pale, wrinkled lengths, each ending in a nail. Some nails were split, others still perfect. Skin shriveled and puckered, as though it had been boiled or soaked in vinegar. The fingers, more than 30 of them, were tangled among the feathers, their stiff curl catching on the quills. A sour, metallic smell drifted up with each faint breeze. It wasn't the smell of chicken. It wasn't the smell of pork. It was something else, something that clung to the back of the throat. Among the feathers was hair, long black strands, matted and stuck together, almost indistinguishable from the finer chicken down until you noticed the thickness. Ferdy swore under his breath. Uncle's gut told him to walk away, but his feet didn't move. They went back to the house. People were watching now, not openly. No one stared them down, but from corners, from shaded doorways, from the half-open slats of windows. The air felt heavier. Their host smiled when they returned, as if nothing was wrong, urging them to eat more. Uncle forced down a few bites so they wouldn't seem suspicious. The meat was still tender, still delicious, but now each chew felt like gambling. Ferdy asked for vinegar to dip the meat in. One of the young men laughed and said, "No vinegar for guests, only sweet beans." He gestured to a bowl of brown paste, smiling like the refusal was a kindness. They drank nothing. When the conversation hit a pause, they thanked their hosts and made an excuse to leave. But Ferdy had one last stop in mind. Another house in the village, just to say hello to someone he knew. Uncle didn't want to go, but refusing might have looked strange. The second house was smaller, more crowded. The smell inside was thicker, darker, as if the air had been trapped for too long. In the yard, under a lean-to, Uncle glimpsed a basin piled high with ribs. Too narrow for pork, too thick for goat. They were red at the ends, the marrow dark. He looked away, but the image was burned into him. They were offered food again, this time with a polite urgency that made it hard to refuse. Uncle ate everything he was given, forcing each bite down, his mind numb. Ferdy didn't touch a thing. They left soon after, their goodbyes too quick, their smiles too stiff. Neither of them ever returned to that barangay. Ferdy never mentioned the girl he'd come to see again. It should have ended there, but the echoes of that night came back years later in another story, this time much closer to home. It was during our own festival season, when everyone in our neighborhood was busy with their own cooking. The air smelled of pork fat, garlic, and the faint sweetness of bibingka baking on coals. Adona had moved in only 4 months earlier. She said she was from Bulacan, but her accent was wrong, soft, rounded, almost like a Longo. She lived with her brother, and they kept mostly to themselves. They were busy cooking too, but something about their preparations caught attention. Maritz, our neighbor, came to my mother with a frown. "They've got a lot of meat over there," she said, "but no one's seen them bring in a pig, or a chicken, or anything." Mama brushed it off at first, but then she started noticing other things. No onions or garlic being chopped. No salt or fish sauce on the counters. Only heaps of tomatoes, bottles of soy sauce, and bright yellow margarine. When Maritz went over to borrow calamansi for a dessert, Adona smiled and said they had none. Maritz knew that was a lie. She'd seen a basket of them in the corner earlier. She offered to get some herself, but Adona's smile tightened. When the feast began, Adona didn't offer food to any of the neighbors. That was unusual, but not unheard of. What was stranger was how she and her relatives didn't join any of the street celebrations. They stayed inside their house, eating only among themselves. They had a dog, but no chickens, no pigs. After the fiesta, the air between them and the rest of the street cooled. They avoided my mother and Maritz. And then, without warning, they were gone. A week later, the news broke. Adona and her brother had been arrested in the city. CCTV footage showed them in the market with 3 children the day before the fiesta. Those children were never seen again. Maritz swore she'd heard from someone that the children had been prepared before the party. There was no proof, only suspicion, only the silence of an empty house. Uncle's trash can full of fingers. Adona's house full of meat with no animal. 2 different stories, but the same rule whispered between them. When there is meat but no sign of the kill, something else has bled in its place. And in these towns, during these festivals, you don't ask too many questions, not if you want to leave Biani's trash can of fingers. Adona's house full of meat without a single slaughter. My own path had already been weaving too close to theirs. It wasn't just the stories. It was the way each one left the same taste in my mouth. The metallic echo of a truth no one dared to speak out loud. The town's invitations had been relentless. Notes slipped under doors. Sentences whispered by children who shouldn't have known my name. We're going down to 15. Come if you want to see where the road ends. I told myself no over and over, but the words were thin. Each night I dreamt pieces of the others. Daeong standing by the heart-shaped fountain with her dagger wet. Loro's face dissolving into nothing as Vivian rode on without him. The salt water peeling the beauty from the woman in San Juan Cerneb. The headless parade beating their drums with bone. The boatman waiting without speaking. The morning I finally said yes, I didn't remember deciding. I only remember standing by the river, the air damp and heavy, Ignacio already waiting in the boat. He didn't smile. You'll see it tonight, he said simply. The ride was long, the bends in the river closing behind us like doors. We passed banks I didn't recognize, huts that seemed abandoned until the faintest movement showed someone was inside, watching. At one bend, the smell changed, richer, meatier, layered with smoke. We arrived as the sky bruised into evening. The village was alive with cooking. Pots over open flames, skewers turning, tables laid with bowls of stew. But there were no animal cries, no slaughtering sounds. The meat was just there, already cut, already cooking. Madel was there, though she hadn't been in my dreams for weeks. She didn't greet me. She just handed me a plate. The meat was tender, impossibly so, and spiced in a way I couldn't place. No garlic, no pepper, no salt. Only a deep, sweet flavor that lingered after swallowing. I forced myself to eat slowly, scanning the crowd. Faces I recognized from the stories. Uncle Biani, younger, glancing at the side of a house as if he expected to see that trash can again. Ferdy, pushing his plate away untouched. Daeong, her dagger at her belt, speaking to no one. Ramel, holding a tray but serving no one. And then I saw them. The bloody couple from Avi's wedding, moving between the tables, touching the shoulders of certain guests. Each touch left the guest sitting straighter, eyes unfocused, chewing with mechanical precision. At the far end of the clearing stood the parade. Not moving yet, just waiting. The women with their ropes, the heads dangling low. The men gripping their drum bones. The trumpeters holding their instruments like weapons. When the drums began, the crowd quieted. The parade moved forward, passing between the tables, each head swinging gently, droplets hitting the dirt. The trumpets blared, thin and sharp, and with each note I felt something tug at my chest, a pulling I couldn't resist. Ignacio appeared beside me. "Now you understand," he said. "What is this?" My voice was barely mine. He looked at me with something like pity. "The road doesn't end. It circles. Every feast you've heard of, every parade, every wedding interrupted, every house with meat and no animal. It's all the same table. And tonight you're sitting at it." The boatman was there too now, standing in the crowd, his pole in hand. He nodded toward the water. "Last chance," he said. Behind me, someone pressed a small packet into my palm. I opened it without thinking. Salt. I didn't remember standing, but I was on my feet. Ignacio's eyes followed me, unreadable. Daeong stepped into my path, holding my gaze. She didn't speak, but I understood. "You can leave, but you will carry it with you." I walked toward the boat. Each step felt heavier, the music pulling, the smell of the meat wrapping around me like smoke. The boatman reached out a hand. When I took it, the world seemed to snap. The music stopped. The smell faded. The crowd blurred, their faces melting into the river mist. As the boat drifted away, I looked back. The clearing was empty. No tables, no parade, just the still, dark line of the shore. "Will I be back?" I asked. The boatman didn't answer, but in my pocket, the salt felt damp, as if it had been in someone's mouth. And I knew the feast would call again, because roads like this never end, they wait.